Welcome, Arlie.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Arlie. I'm a freelance audio producer and um, these days sound designer and mix engineer, actually more than producing. But yeah, this series, so what we're going to listen to is the fifth episode from a series that I produced in 2022 called A Positive Life, HIV from Terrence Higgins to Today. A mouthful title that we were made to have. But anyway, yeah, it was a series. It was 8 parts made for BBC Wales, and the um, kind of brief for the series was to tell it was 40 years since Terrence Higgins had died, and he was one of the first people to die of an AIDS-related illness in the UK. And his friends set up this charity, the Terrence Higgins Trust, that a lot of people probably know. It's a really big HIV charity. So it was 40 years since he died in 2022. So the brief was to make a series that would look at the life story of Terrence Higgins, with kind of the idea that most people he was kind of famous for how he died, but not a lot was known about his life. And to then like look at the last 40 years of the HIV epidemic in the UK. So it's quite a like big brief. So kind of the challenge was like figure out what was that going to be, like how what actually would be included in that series and how to make it. So I've chose the first half hour of the fifth episode to listen to, because I just think it's like gives quite a good example of like some of the stuff, the challenges, I suppose, of making the series. So we've got a kind of main contributor that we hear from, but also it's trying to situate her story within the stage of the epidemic that we're at kind of chronologically in the series. And yeah, I just thought it was like it has a bunch of elements that show kind of some of what needed to go in the series to make it work, and so I thought that might be useful for like discussion and stuff. And yeah, just to say like a couple of things about what I wanted to do with the series, that's maybe also just useful to think about if there's a sparking questions and stuff. So I obviously like needed to meet the brief of like what the series was going to be. Um, I wanted to like, as part of it, I really wanted to show the diversity of people that are affected by HIV, because people, I don't know, especially with Terry Higgins being like the main focus at the beginning, a lot of people think of like gay men, especially like white gay men, as this really big affected group, but there's lots of other groups that are particularly affected by HIV. So I wanted the series to show all of that. And I wanted all the people in the series to get to feel like whole rounded people that had lives also beyond just living with HIV, even though that was a lot of what I was going to talk to them about. So I wanted to think of ways to show those people as more than just the story of getting their diagnosis of HIV or whatever. Um, and I wanted, last thing I'll say, I wanted to like the thing that was became really clear to me working on the series was like the reason that the epidemic is still ongoing and the challenges with continuing, to work on that are all caused by like systemic like inequality issues. It's like it's all to do with like the social determinants of health, and it's all about the stigma around HIV. That's the biggest problem, why like why it's an ongoing challenge. And so I really wanted the series to not just be like about individual people or stories, but to like speak to the systemic issues that make it a challenge still. So yeah, that was like those were my big things that I wanted the series to do, which I just thought was worth maybe mentioning, because then that might be useful to have in mind listening in case that, yeah, sparks questions. So yeah, this is the fifth episode, the first half hour of that. And yeah, I think that's everything I have to say before we listen.
Lovely. Thank you, Arlie. Yeah, so for the next half an hour, we're going to listen, and then we have time after that for a Q&A. So like we said before, just prep your questions and deliver them to me in the way that you see fit, and hopefully we'll have a nice chat off the back of it. Thank you, Arlie. All right, I'm going to click play, and if just give me a thumbs up to make sure it's working. And then I'm going to turn my camera off, and I'm inviting you all to do the same as well. Right, let's go.
I can do a mean Whitney karaoke, okay?
This is karaoke queen Angelina Namiba.
I'm in a choir, and I've always sang in choir from when I was in school. I definitely cannot sing like my daughter can.
Just a young girl in the city waiting on love, just waiting on love.
Her stage name is Hamza, so that's HAMZAA. I love her music.
I still got time to figure out the woman I wanna be.
Angelina may claim she can't sing like her daughter, but clearly Hamza is getting it from somewhere.
I have won a bottle of champagne at a karaoke venue somewhere when I was at uni. I have 3 signature tunes, right? So I sing Saving All My Love by Whitney. I sing Still the One by Shania Twain. And then I have a friend of mine, whenever we go karaoke together, we'll sing Something Inside So Strong.
I'm sure that I'll find that feeling. I'm sure that I'll find that feeling.
When Angelina's not getting her life at karaoke, she's a founding member of the 4M network. It stands for My Health, My Choice, My Child, My Life. Angelina and the team train women with HIV to mentor each other through the process of having kids, from pregnancy through everything that comes after.
I've achieved many things in my life, but having my daughter is one of my greatest achievements.
I didn't know before. I had a hard time learning that in life there's more. In life there's more than the way that I've been treated in the past. I'm sure I always move too far.
I'm Sam Smith, and this is A Positive Life. In this series, we're meeting some of the people who've been affected by HIV over the last 40 years. People who lived with it, lost people to it, survived it, are thriving with it. And people who are fighting to make sure no one is left behind or alone with it. In the episode so far, we've heard stories from the earliest years of the AIDS crisis. Right up to the point where the government's national campaign about AIDS finally started in 1986.
Disease, and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed.
As we move through the 80s, with no real treatments available, HIV transmissions continued to rise. In 1988, the country found a new way to write homophobia into law, as Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government instituted Section 28, banning, and I'm quoting the regulations here, the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship.
Our major concern has been that small children, some as young as 5 when they start school, have actually had homosexuality thrust at them. There has been a promotional exercise on very young children indeed.
Section 28 wouldn't be fully repealed for 15 years. It was still the law when I started secondary school. When the 80s came to a close, it felt like the end of an era. And then, the turn of a new decade.
What a wonderful piece of play by Maradona. And a place in the final of the World Cup of 1990 is going to be decided from the spot.
In a few moments, Nelson Mandela is due to walk away from here after 27 years of incarceration in South African jails.
The historic moment has arrived when the era of Thatcherism is over. We must now turn our attention to the new agenda, the new ideas, and the new political parties of the 1990s.
The early 90s also marked a decade living with the HIV epidemic. In the UK, many thousands had already died.
Hundreds gathered in central London to highlight the catastrophe of AIDS. There were calls for further research into the virus and more to be done for AIDS sufferers.
Though we understood the virus better, we were still several years away from finding the life-saving treatments we have today.
HIV was seen as a terminal illness.
Dr. Ragashri Derawan.
Treatment at that time was very much about treating the symptoms of HIV and AIDS, so treating infections, for example.
HIV organisations and charities offered hospice care to those who were dying and provided support for people living with HIV in a world that had attached incredible stigma to this virus. By now, AIDS was a word everyone knew, and it was associated in most people's minds with gay men, intravenous drug users, and haemophilia. Early in the epidemic, some people in government and healthcare even believed people outside those groups wouldn't be affected by HIV at all. But that was never the case.
Most people living with HIV in the UK are gay and bisexual men, but we also have women living with HIV in the UK. They make up about a third. Globally, actually, the majority of people living with HIV are women.
For me, I always call HIV the equal opportunities illness. It can affect anybody, whether you're black, white, gay, straight, young, old.
Angelina Namiba has lived with HIV since right back in the early 90s.
The first few support groups that I went to, there was quite a lot of gay men. But whether you're a gay man or an African woman, I think we're all impacted by HIV. And I saw the solidarity way back then, and I continue to see it up to today. HIV is not necessarily a nice illness to have, but it has united a lot of us over the years.
This is Dalston, in the London borough of Hackney, where Angelina has lived for the past 22 years.
If you ask me where home is, I always tell you Kenya, but this is also home from home.
Angelina's sitting on her sofa, 2 crochet hooks working away.
So I'm crocheting a snood.
One of those tubular scarf things. One thing you need to know about Angelina is she spends a lot of time crocheting snoods, including throughout the entirety of this recording.
This is Christmas, birthdays, you name it, you're getting a snood. Whether you like it or not. I need to shift them.
Angelina is the youngest of 5 siblings.
When they brought me back from the hospital, my dad's younger brother was staying with us at the time. He named me Baby Sham. It was a very popular drink for ladies during that time, so they all call me Baby, but in Swahili we kind of call it Baby. For a long time, I don't even think my dad knew what my real name was, because they all just call me up to today, Baby.
As many youngest siblings will know, being the baby of the family comes with some advantages.
As a teenager, I think I was a little bit naughty. We used to like going out, teenage discos and things like that. My brother was my ally. I'd throw a stone at his window and he would let me in. He said, "I'm not letting you in again next time." And of course, the next weekend I'd be out again. The stone and he'd let me in.
When Angelina was still a kid, her mum got a scholarship to study social work at Swansea University in Wales. So her mum moved to the UK. And when Angelina was 23, she started a degree at Manchester University.
My course was called Information Technology and Library Management, which is a glorified name for a librarian. I graduated in 92, 93.
By then, her mum was a social worker for Hackney Council in London, and Angelina moved down from Manchester to join her. But just as she should have been getting excited for the next chapter of her life, Angelina got news that would change everything.
I was diagnosed 6 months after my graduation. We're talking in the early 90s. This was before we had the effective, anti-HIV treatment that we have now. The images that you had were of, ill, emaciated, people who were dying. One of the enduring images that I have around that time was a picture of Freddie Mercury on the cover of one of the Red Tops.
The pop star Freddie Mercury died last night in London.
There'd been speculation about Freddie Mercury's health for months. An admitted bisexual, he confirmed at the weekend that he was suffering from AIDS.
When Freddie died of an AIDS-related illness in 1991, it was really shocking. As the frontman of Queen, he was one of the most famous musicians in the world. Freddie had been hounded in the press for years over rumours he might have AIDS. But for the longest time, he'd always either denied it or ignored it. In 1991, he finally released a statement. Following the enormous conjecture in the press over the last 2 weeks, I wish to confirm that I have been tested HIV positive and have AIDS. I felt it correct to keep this information private to date. Reading that statement makes me feel incredibly emotional. This terrible disease. My privacy. The thing that jumps out to me the most is privacy. We forget our humanity, I think, sometimes around icons. We feel so connected to artists and makes you feel like you know them. But the truth is we don't. It's their right to have privacy, especially through these horrific times in their lives. Freddie's statement came out on November the 23rd, 1991. He died the next day.
Although his tragic story has put the issue back on the front pages, health education experts worry it may actually reinforce attitudes they've been working hard to counter.
With this kind of atmosphere surrounding AIDS, just the idea of taking a HIV test would have been frightening for anyone. And that's exactly how it felt for Angelina. When she moved to London, her new GP saw she'd had hepatitis B at uni.
So he asked me to go for an HIV test. And it was quite a shock because it was something that wasn't on my radar. I didn't go for a test. I took the piece of paper and I hid it under the bed. From that point on, everywhere I looked, it almost like there was HIV everywhere.
Something that made the idea of a HIV test even more intimidating for Angelina was that her brother had already been diagnosed with HIV about a year earlier.
He got very ill. He had all the opportunistic infections going. So he had Kaposi sarcoma, he had meningitis, he had TB, he had epileptic fits. Since he told us about his status, a lot of the time he spent in and out of hospices. Around that time, all doctors could do was to provide palliative care.
So Angelina's GP had asked her to go for a HIV test, and he was expecting to see results after a couple of weeks. But the result never arrived. He knew she hadn't done it.
He called me to the surgery. I refused to go. Then he wrote me a letter and he said, I strongly suggest that you go for an HIV test.
Eventually, Angelina made herself go. She spoke to a counsellor beforehand, and she found one trusted friend she could tell.
I told my friend Sissy that I'm going to go for this test. So she was the only person, in a way, that I felt I could tell.
The test came back positive.
It was a challenging time to get a diagnosis.
Partly because people still thought of HIV only really affecting gay men. Angelina felt like she was the only woman in London living with HIV.
I didn't really know anybody else, any other woman. I then also got offered a job in almost the same week that I was diagnosed as an information officer for one of the Department of Health libraries. I decided, let me take the job and keep myself busy while I'm waiting to die. I thought, I'm not going to sit here and stare at these four walls, while I wait.
No one, apart from Cece, even knew Angelina had been for a HIV test. Then one day, she was hanging out with another close friend.
She said to me, Angelina, I have something to tell you.
To Angelina's astonishment, this friend told her, I have HIV.
And I went, yes. Not because she had HIV, just because here is another woman living in London. She's my friend and she also has HIV. Oh my God. I told her straight away. We were close before, but we became even closer then because this is something else that we shared. And what she did for me was one of the things that I'll never forget. She took me along to a support group where I met a few other women, about 5 or so of them one was working, one was the mom. They're just leading regular lives. And so I got a lot of peer support from them and from her, of course. And having had that peer support, I think that really, really helped me to cope.
Meeting people who are living with HIV to make this podcast, one thing that comes up all the time is the difference it makes to have other people around you that understand. People who face the same fears as you and who've dealt with the stigma. That's true today for so many people, and it was true then for Angelina.
It's one of the things that led me to start volunteering within the HIV sector.
Angelina started working for a charity called Positively Women. It had been set up in 1987 by 2 women called Sheila and Jane. They were living with HIV, but found there were no women's services. So they put up posters in clinics and held the first meetings in their living room. The charity still exists today. It's now Positively UK. And it's for anyone, regardless of gender, age, or sexuality. Back when Angelina first found them, Positively Women had a magazine they used to send out to subscribers.
So I would write an article, and initially I would write by Angie, and then a few issues down the line I wrote by Angelina, and then I carried on writing the next issue I wrote by Angelina and Amoeba. And then by the following issue, I was on the cover of the magazine.
Angelina found a community. And slowly, she became more comfortable with sharing her diagnosis.
And I met other women who'd been able to share their status with significant others, and some of them were open about the status. It made it easier for me to start sharing my status. And one of the first people I told was my mom. But this is the how not to tell your mother you have HIV.
Angelina's brother, the one who'd also had HIV, had recently passed away.
He died of PCP. It's a type of HIV-related pneumonia. My mom was really, we were all affected by his death, but she was even more so because she had been diagnosed with bipolar and manic depression. At the point where he passed away, I think things got even worse. I used to go and visit her, just to give her a bit of comfort. But sometimes I would leave feeling even more down than when I went in.
One day, Angelina was talking to her mum on the phone.
And she was still very much focusing on how she was, how ill she was. And then I got a bit angry. And so we were kind of in the middle of an argument. And I said, well, I'm also ill. And she says, well, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I have HIV. In the next 2 seconds, I thought, oh my God, what have I done? You don't tell your mother you have HIV over the phone. But luckily for me, her response was, I wish I was near you to give you a hug. Her reaction, I believe, is what set me on the path of being open about my status, because I thought, well, if my mom is cool about it, then not that bothered about what anybody else thinks.
Through the first half of the 90s, organisations like Positively Women work with the people impacted by HIV, providing services, building their confidence and fighting stigma. And at the same time, on the medical side, the hunt continued to find a treatment that would stop HIV and save people's lives.
The first drug that was licensed to treat HIV was a drug called AZT, or zidovudine.
This is Dr. Ragashri Derawan again.
And that was a drug which was previously trialled to treat cancer but not found to work very well. And at that time, they were trying out different drugs to see really was there anything that could treat the HIV. AZT was given to people in drug trials initially, and it was given in quite high doses. It was found to be effective at delaying the onset of AIDS, so people could live a little bit longer, but it was very, very toxic.
So it caused other health conditions for the people who took it. Problems with their kidneys, livers, bone marrow.
And people had terrible side effects. So, for example, it could cause people to become very anemic. And so they may have needed blood transfusions. They had terrible muscle aches, problems with nausea, vomiting, tiredness, headaches. Not at all a pleasant drug to take, but the only thing that was available at the time.
People struggled on with the medicines that were being trialled, but usually, ultimately, they were expecting to die. And that's how it was, all the way up to 1996.
In the past few months, great breakthroughs have been made in understanding how the HIV virus attacks the body and in developing new drugs to fight it.
In the mid-90s, they discovered a different type of drug called a protease inhibitor, and they discovered that if they combined this drug with a couple of other new drugs that were coming through combination treatment, that was what really treated the HIV.
For 15 years, we'd had no way of stopping the deaths caused by HIV. And then, all of a sudden, we did.
Seeing the shift was just like mind-blowing. I and many of my peers felt very lucky to be living at that time.
It was magical.
This is Juno Roche, who we met back in episode 3.
You'd gone from this thing which was definitely going to kill you and horribly kill you. It wasn't going to take you out silently, it was going to bruise you black and blue, and we went from that to having some kind of hope. I couldn't understand the drugs themselves, but I could understand that they enabled me to stay alive and to be alive and to encounter more life. It was epic in a way that you couldn't imagine, because we didn't think there'd ever be a cure.
The results of the studies into these new life-saving HIV treatments were presented at the International AIDS Conference in Vancouver in 1996, and it was incredibly exciting. But for people who'd been living with this epidemic for so many years, it also meant doing a complete psychological 180.
There was this big shift saying, great, well, we've got this medication that can manage this, and so you're not going to die.
This is Rupert Whittaker, who we met in earlier episodes. He is one of the founders of the Terrence Higgins Trust, and Terry Higgins' boyfriend at the time he died. Rupert experienced firsthand just how difficult it was for some people to adjust to this new reality.
On the one hand, you had what was called the Lazarus syndrome. People were literally on their deathbeds. They received this new treatment and they'd get up and they would start to resume their life. Some of them had no life to resume. They were penniless. Being able to get back to work was not quite the same as surviving. There were 40-year-olds who looked as though they were in their late 60s or 70s because their bodies were wrecked from early treatments, from the ravages of AIDS itself. It's not simply get off your deathbed and go skipping off into the sunrise.
You've been pushed out of society completely. Somehow now you were going to live in a society that didn't like you.
There were a lot of very injured people who survived. And the effects of that, some killed themselves. Some had these wonderful medications, took them for a couple of years and then stopped and died. Making that shift was incredibly difficult.
To be completely honest, I had sort of hit this self-destruct button.
This is Mark Ward, who we met last episode. He acquired HIV through his haemophilia treatment in the 1980s, and he's a core participant in the public inquiry happening now into the contaminated blood scandal in the UK. By 1996, Mark had been living with HIV and all the stigma that came with it for 12 years.
My career was just ruined. All my dreams, everything was crumbling around me. The only thing I had was my friends on the gay scene, and all I wanted to do was just go out and get completely wasted. Because when I walked into the club and I popped a pill or I started on the booze, I wasn't Mark the haemophiliac dying of AIDS. I was the party animal who was dancing on the tabletops, who was going to FF and trade and heaven, and I was enjoying myself. When I came home, I then had the choice. Do I take this muck that made me throw up and gave me such severe diarrhoea that all I wanted to do was just curl up and die? Or do I just say, sod it, I'm going to go out with a bang?
For the long-term survivors, and there are quite a few of us, we've still got to live with the legacy of this. I think there's a lack of recognition of how difficult holding our lives together has been.
The first 15 years of this epidemic left another legacy too, beyond the trauma and the loss of life. Because even when the new drugs came along,
it didn't change the stigma. That's never changed. I've got people that really like me that would still say something like, yeah, well, it's always going to be difficult for you to find someone. Because people's views of it as being this virus that sets you apart from the rest of the world.
If you think about people with other long-term illnesses, when they get diagnosed, one of the first things they want to do is to go home and share it with their nearest and dearest. But with HIV, it's like, oh my goodness, I don't want to tell anybody because I don't know what their reaction is going to be.
And that didn't change overnight just because HIV was now treatable. And for many people, it still hasn't changed now.
If people hear about somebody who's got HIV, they automatically want to moralize and they want to make judgments. You know, it's almost become like a moral issue. You know, one of the ways that HIV is passed on is, you know, through sexual contact. But people don't want to talk about sex. It's a taboo subject.
I've definitely grown up with shame and fear around sex. I remember my mum finding out that I was watching porn for the first time when I was very young. And my mum was actually incredible. She sat me down and she said to me, I've clicked on the links that you're watching. And I was mortified when she said that. And then she said to me, I just want you to know that two men can also make love. And I thought that was a really amazing thing to say to me. Sex is something to be enjoyed, it's something that's beautiful, and I truly believe that we can fight the shame and the fear just through education.
You know, as far as I'm concerned, HIV is a virus. It's not a moral issue. It's a tiny virus, that's entered people's bodies, and we just need to manage it. I always say, HIV has come into my body. It doesn't define who I am, and it will certainly live by my rules.
There we go. That is the end of episode 5 of A Positive Life by Arlie. So hi everyone, welcome back to the room. I just wanted to, for those that jumped in a little bit after we kicked off, I just wanted to kind of reiterate what we've been doing. So for those that joined late, this is masterclass focused on a non-fiction storytelling structure, and Arlie's just shared extract of episode 5 of the 8-part podcast series A Positive Life, HIV from Terrence Higgins to today, and it was presented by the artist and musician Sam Smith and broadcast originally on the BBC. I'm going to pop a link in the chat because you can still hear the series, that's right, isn't it, Arlie?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On BBC Sounds. So if people want to go away and re-listen or start from the beginning or find out more, that's where you can find it. So yeah, have a little think of, guys, now that you've heard that piece about any reflections, any questions you have for Arlie. I'm going to kick off, and just let me know if you want to ask it directly or if you'd rather I read it out. We're more than happy to have people jump in. It'd be lovely to hear some of your voices and to hear, maybe kick off with your name, pronouns, and whether or not what kind of experience level you're at, just so we get a bit of a context of who you are. That'd be wonderful. But yes, thank you, Arlie. That was amazing. And obviously the first thing to note is it's just such an emotional and massive topic and such a sensitive topic. So I suppose my first question is how you navigated that. Where do you start?
Yeah, that was, I'd say, like one of the big challenges of the series was, I mean, I do think sometimes when you're making something, this is probably different for different people, but for me, like, I'll just be kind of in it, and like often it's like later I'll be hit more by the emotions. It's like obviously emotions of like some of the difficult stories you're hearing and stuff, like it's not like you're not noticing them while you're making it, but like I've definitely had times where like even just like when I like re-listened to this episode the other day when I was trying to decide what would be a good one, and like hearing Rupert talk again, it like gets me like welling up. And like when I've like emailed with him and stuff, sometimes that like kind of sets me off because it's almost like later sometimes when you like step back from it that those things like hit me more. But one of the things I did find quite challenging making it was like the sense of responsibility that I felt over the stories, or the people and the stories that they were sharing. So like I felt that it was a big deal to me that people were happy to talk to me for the podcast, and basically I knew from talking to them and just living in the world, but like people would say to me they all had like lots of experiences of like talking to people in the media, and then the thing that gets made is actually really stigmatizing itself, and like everyone had bad experiences with that. And so even though everyone like wanted to be part of it, and like I kind of carried that weight quite heavily, and I'm not sure I even have a like, and this is how you deal with it response to that, because actually that was very difficult for me in this series. I mean, I did kind of get into quite a state of anxiety about like worrying, was I going to do justice to this? But I do like my reflection on it, having done it, is like I think that this series would like, so I was like the main producer and sound designer, and I had an assistant producer who worked on it for about 3 weeks across the series, but most of it I was just doing. And I do think that a series like this would benefit from being co-produced with like say a couple of producers, because I would have, and I had an exec as well, but it's not like the relationship between a producer and exec is not quite the same as a co-producer, like really a collaborator on all the making. And I think I would have really benefited from having a co-producer who I could have, when I was getting really like worried about like, oh, am I gonna like, you know, do the right thing, or am I going to get this right? Am I going to like do justice to it? That could have just talked me down and been like, yeah, you know, like you actually probably are, because if you're this worried about it, then you're probably like being quite thoughtful about how you're doing it, and you're probably not going to make a terrible mistake. But like I kind of didn't have that, so I was able to like become quite worried about that. So yeah, I'd say like I also didn't have that long to make it because it was linked to an anniversary, which was in the July of that year. They couldn't like move the deadline, so I only had a few months to make it. And like, so yeah, my like reflections would be like, you need a good amount of time for a series like this, and like you need to not be ideally kind of holding it on your own. You need like a person to like share that, the emotional side with. So yeah, don't know if that sort of answers the question or something.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you say about, yeah, second guessing things and feeling the pressure is just completely natural, right? And if you're a creative producer, that's kind of part and parcel of caring about the work. And this is a piece that you've obviously is kind of a personal, whilst you're making it for a client, it's still, you know, you're still putting a lot of yourself into that. You've had a few questions. I'm going to read one out from Farina. Farina, unless you want to jump in, just go for it. But this is something I was going to ask anyway, Arlie. In terms of structure, and obviously we had just heard episode 5, so we're like kind of just over midway through at this point. How did story structure, how much of it was planned in advance, and how much of it was obviously changed course once you sort of secured your contributors, and yeah, how much of that did you lay out in advance?
Yeah, so basically like I suppose the thing that I used as like the backbone for like how to structure the story was just the historical chronology. So starting from kind of the beginning of the AIDS crisis, like the beginning of the 80s, through to 2022. And so like one of the first things me and Emma, the assistant producer, did was like make a Google Doc that was like a historical timeline, and we put into that literally anything related to the HIV epidemic. Anytime we came across any event or significant thing, we put it just in order in this like timeline. And also a bit of like cultural, you know, like you've heard some of the stuff in that episode where we were kind of trying to place, you know, when it's like the beginning of the 90s and it's like what stuff is going on that we can try and help give a sense of like what was the vibes of that time kind of in the country. And so that was like really helpful because from that we can pull out certain things and be like, we obviously like kind of need to hit these things. I think you have to hit like when did the, you know, the government's like national campaign, you have to hit like 1996 when the effective treatments come out, stuff like that you know you've got to do. And then like the idea that I had for the series was that I wanted to like speak to a bunch of different contributors who could speak from like different perspectives, different kinds of people, different experiences that they'd had. And I had this idea that if I could get contributors of like a range of ages, then I could bring people into the story at a moment in the historical context where they could kind of like, yeah, the sort of experience they were going to talk about in the interview would be related to the bigger context historically. So in that episode, you know, Angelina, you know, she is like someone I wanted to talk to because she's a woman, she's a Black woman, she has that perspective. And also she gets her diagnosis in the early 90s and then has the experience of living with HIV, and then this memory of when the effective treatments came in, so she can tell her personal story. That's something we want to hear. And also she can situate us in that really key point of the 90s that we're going to talk about on a bigger level beyond just Angelina's personal story. And I had this idea that you know, I could bring people back. So as someone's life progressed, so the time is progressing in the chronology of the podcast, but so people could reappear later. So someone like Juno and Rupert, who were very young at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, both of them acquired HIV really early, probably around 81, like really at the beginning. And so they appear in the early part of the podcast, and they can speak to what was it like to live in the UK during the early days of the AIDS crisis. But then they can come back like later, like in the 90s, and they come back even again, like right at the end when we're kind of like up to date, and they can be like, and this is what it was like at that point, and they're now this age. And yeah, so I guess I had this idea to be able to do that. And so then it was like trying to find contributors that kind of could work in that. And so, you know, of course it like, so I had to like also mold it around, because you can't just be like, now find the perfect person for that idea. You've got to also find just like people you actually want to interview, and like who seem like they're gonna be great to hear from, and who actually wants to talk to you, and all of these different things. So I don't think I'd mapped out like, I'd kind of like I'd sort of had a plan in that sense of like, what's the story and the timeline, and what's the kind of thing that I want to hear, how do I want it like sort of to feel. And then it was like finding people, and then kind of finding some middle ground between that. But yeah, I hadn't been like, I'll this exact type of person at this exact point, or this is the story I want to hear, if you know what I mean. It was like, then okay, what are the actual stories, and then how can I like piece that together, if that sort of makes sense.
Absolutely. So I kind of see this kind of narrative structure with fiction, non-fiction. What am I saying? Yeah, non-fiction. It's kind of like going back to the sort of the old documentary days, but now these are kind of segmented into you know, roughly half-an-hour pieces. But so my background was starting out in doing documentary storytelling for Radio 1 on a kind of more music level, but that's the kind of way that we would structure like an hour. You would always have an idea, but then that is always going to get moved and changed. And I think the only way that would maybe be different perhaps is obviously if you're dramatizing something where it's all laying that out from the beginning, or maybe a more intense narrative podcast that is you know, has a beginning, middle and an end. But yeah, more documentary style, and it just makes sense, doesn't it, to be guided by your contributors.
I think one thing just to say, like, that's like an example of like a thing that there's like how you plan it, and then there's like the reality of, you know, and just like reacting to what happens is like, for example, there's kind of, I think like the next episode is part of what it's focused on is like having children, and like, you know, like people who have HIV, and the fact that they can now get pregnant and have a child, and they're not going to pass on, you know, if you're on effective treatment, you won't pass on HIV to your baby. And like that's something, when I was in the early stages of being like, okay, how shall I do this 40 years of this epidemic story, I don't know if I had thought, let me have an episode focused on like having kids. But as I met people and learned more and spoke to people and worked out who I wanted to interview, there was people who that was a thing they could speak to and wanted to speak to, that was important to them. And so that became part of the series, but I didn't necessarily know going in it was going to be, but it was, you know, it came up with Angelina. It's a big part of the story with Susan, who's the next person in the next episode. And then the final episode of the series, we have a young person who was about 22 when I interviewed her, who had had HIV since birth. And so there were these various storylines around like pregnancy and having kids that were things that went into the series as I learned more about what are the stories to tell, and what are the things that are important to people who are living with HIV. Anyway, so just like that.
No, it's great. And I suppose it's all about dispelling the myths, right? So like the perception of what this illness was and who was affected by it is such a big part of the story, which people are slowly learning more about. When Arlie and I spoke the other day, obviously was talking about It's a Sin and how much of a big impact that had on the mainstream and people understanding. Whilst that was still only one kind of 80s narrative, but it's sort of a jump off point. I could ask you many, many more questions, but a few people have raised their hand. So I wanted to jump to Charlie, if you're up for speaking, Charlie, still.
Hey, yeah, I was maybe gonna let it go, but thanks. I'll ask anyway. Yeah, Charlie, she, her. I've listened to the whole series. It's really, really great. And I was going to say something else, but it sort of slipped my mind. Yeah, just how nuanced it is. Like, for example, in that episode when it touches on the development of the drug AZT, I feel a lot of previous narratives around that have been like, that's just a positive thing. So to hear actually how so many people struggled actually after that sort of turning point, which in a lot of other ways is like framed as just a positive thing, was really interesting. But the question I had was actually off the back of what you said a while ago about, you spoke with a lot of people who had had a previous negative experience telling their story. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you got them on board in that case. I'm very mindful about ethical sort of storytelling, and it can be sometimes difficult when you're pushed and you're up against the deadline, but how did you actually then navigate that and get those people to take part?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like I have like a thing that I always say about this, so I'm going to say it now, and then if anyone's seen me say it before, sorry that I'm being a broken record. But the thing that I always say on this topic is like that the most important thing is not to learn the skill of like persuading people to trust you and to talk to you. The most important thing is to be someone who they should trust, who they'd be right to trust. And so like that's like should always be the starting point. So I mean, and I had, I worried about will I manage to do this, but I absolutely had like the intention of trying to make something that would not be upsetting to the people that then had taken part in it, or generally the wider community of people living with HIV that might hear it. So I hope that I tried to be a person who would be right to earn their trust if I did. And then the way I approached it basically was, first I'd usually write someone an email, explaining a bit about it. And I chatted to people, like I'd have a phone call or a Zoom with them if they're kind of interested in hearing more. But what I was like saying to them in those conversations was kind of a bit of what I said at the beginning before we listened to the piece, that one of the things I really wanted to do with the series was like have the people, obviously explain the concept of the series and the overall like what would be covered in it. But then I talked to them about like how I wanted the people to be the people I interviewed to like get to feel like fully rounded people. So I wanted to be able to not just go straight in with, I guess with someone like Angelina, I could have been like, oh, so you like do this work with the 4M network, can you tell me how that came about? Like you could just go straight into that and just be like, right, HIV, how does this relate to your life, tell me. But what I did was I said to people I wanted to do quite long interviews with them, and I did like the longest interviews I've done, I think, for pretty much anything, like sort of 2 or 3 hour interviews, and spent quite a bit of time with people. And the reason I did that was because I was like, okay, so like, where were you born? Tell me about your childhood, blah, blah, blah. And of course you can only then include like a little bit of that, but I found that like you don't have to include loads to get a sense of a person, and like just keep little snippet. It lets you get little snippets of like their personality, like things that make them laugh, whatever. But anyway, so I explained to people that that was like a part of what I wanted to do. And I asked people what they would, what was important to them, what would they want to talk about, what would they want to hear in a series like this. And that was like a genuine, like, I'm figuring out what this series is going to be, and I've got my ideas of what I think I need to do, but only by talking to these people can I figure out the stuff I don't know yet that should actually be part of it. And then tried to, as much as I could, like, shape the series based on, okay, like I'm going to speak to this person, I know this thing's really important to them, so that's going to now come into the series. So that was really just explaining my, I suppose, like vision for what the series would be, and people liked that. They liked the idea, and then it was like, okay, I have to now try to deliver what I've said I'm going to do. And part of how you when you communicate that, you have to say, this is what I'm envisioning, this is my aim, it's going to change somehow in the making, because that's just creative process. So it's also like being really clear with people what you can and can't promise them is going to happen with how it all comes out. But I think like if people can see that the intention is there, they'll know that even if creatively the treatment sort of changes a bit as you actually make it, the way it will go is still going to be in a direction that they feel comfortable with. But yeah, it has to be true that that is, you know, and there is, you know, I think you mentioned like being on a deadline or other factors, like you don't always have all of the control over these things. So you have to be honest about what you can and can't control, and that sort of thing as well. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question a little
That's
bit.
really helpful. Thank you.
Cool.
That leads me on actually to a question about, I suppose, obviously this is a BBC commission, well, BBC Wales specifically, right? But it's obviously on Sounds, which is available to everybody. And Terrence Higgins Trust directly involved. So yeah, how much input did both of those institutions, I suppose, have in the storytelling, or were you kind of left alone?
Yeah, so the BBC itself was pretty hands off, which was good. Like they had commissioned it. It wasn't pitched by me, it was pitched by Overcoat Media in Wales. And then once they got the commission, they were looking for a producer to make it. So I came on once it had been commissioned. But what was nice was they had kind of like an outline they'd used to pitch. And they had started making connection with the Terrence Higgins Trust, which was really good. So it was like on their radar already. But they were then like, here's we've got the commission, you're the producer, but you can actually do what you want, which was really nice. So I had, obviously there's things I had to do, like it was a story about Terrence Higgins and blah blah blah, you know, but like I had a lot of freedom then with what I chose to do with those episodes. And the BBC were not really involved up until they were listening to episodes to do compliance, and that was mostly happening the week that episodes came out, because it was so, I didn't have very long. I think I started working on it in like March, April, and that was kind of part-time because I was finishing something else, and it came out in July. So it was really quite a fast production process. So I was really up against like the deadlines for all the episodes. So they really just listened to it at compliance. So which is kind of good in a way, but the bad if they have an issue with something because you don't have a lot of time to resolve it, which did happen like once, which I won't go into like right now, but for the most part was fine. And then in terms of the Terrence Higgins Trust, so that was like a relationship that had to be really like carefully, you know, looked after and managed, because it wasn't a collaboration with them. It was, you know, an independent BBC production, but it was very important to have them on board because they were able to provide a lot of the important contacts for us, you know, putting us in touch with Rupert and Martin, Rupert was Terry Higgins' boyfriend at the time he died. Martin was one of his best friends. They're really important contributors in the series. But they were very, you know, they're also used to the media, you know, making stuff, and they want to support stuff to be made. And so they, you know, we had meetings with them before, and we were in touch with them during the production process and after. But, you know, they didn't have editorial input, and, you know, that's something you have to like manage a little bit delicately, because it's like, of course we want you to be happy with what we've made, but we have to also maintain our editorial independence from the charity. So yeah, does that sort of answer that question? Basically, top headline, we actually were kind of like left alone to do it,
which
really
is
nice.
a dream as a producer. Although, like we
Yeah.
were saying before, you sometimes nice to have someone to kind of bounce ideas off of, so that you know you're on the right track, because it can get very much like a mind map. Like I always think of it as like Minority Report. You're trying to deal with all of this content. Or Sherlock Holmes. I'd like to go to another question from Momo this time. So do you want to just jump in? Ask away.
Hi everyone, my name's actually Moeed. I don't know why it says Momo on my little bio. Hi Arlie. You're right. Hi Arlie, how's it going? You're right.
Yeah, good. Nice to see you, Moeed.
Yeah, how's it going? Arlie and I had the privilege of working with Arlie when was it, like 2020, we made some podcast
2020.
advice, yeah,
Mhm.
which went very well. But obviously from that day, learned a lot from you and your creative process, and it's amazing to see how far you flourished. My question in particular was more about the music. I always find music a little bit, I end up just listening to loads of tracks because I like music. So how did you kind of, from that half an hour segment that, we listened to, it was evident, obviously there's a lot of SFX, there's a lot of music, especially when I think the most one I really remember was like she talked about a book and the page turned, and it's so small, but like it makes a massive impact on the entire piece. So what's your creative process when it comes to SFX, to music? Like, are there particular people you use regularly, or is it just like as you go along, you're like, cool, that sounds good there, let me add this in, kind of thing?
Yeah, it's funny when I like re-listened to it the other day before this, I was like, oh, there's a lot of sound design. I was like, oh, I kind of forgot how much sound design there was in it. But yeah, like so yeah, I just had like for music, I just had access to Epidemic, the music library. That was just like the library the production company had. So like that's where I was getting all the music from, and it's always a bit of a challenge with music libraries trying to find like good stuff, and I don't know, maybe not all of it was even that great. I just did my best, but that was like where the music came from. And then like the sound effects would have been like a mixture of like Epidemic and everyone's favorite website, freesound.org, etc. But yeah, like, so my process is like with this series, I had quite a like methodical process of producing it because I used Descript to do all the editing, structuring, and script writing of like the episodes. Which meant I wasn't doing any like sound design stuff, and I was, making notes to myself. I'll like put markers in, be like, oh, maybe this, or music here, or like maybe this kind of sound design as I'm like doing that editing. But it was all like completely dry in the like complete, like I made basically every episode in terms of like all of the tape and the script in Descript, which was like very helpful considering the amount of stuff I'd recorded so much. Like I said, I did really long interviews, and also I had contributors appearing across multiple episodes. And I think the multi-track fellows, I think next week maybe I'm doing a little Descript session with you guys, so you guys get to see a little bit more of how that works. But anyway, so then once I've got all the episodes like structured and scripted, and they're like quite obviously they're still going to change, but they're basically like a good V1 draft exists of each episode, then I would export it from Reaper, from Descript, and work in Reaper, which is the software that I use. And that's when all the sort of sound design stuff would happen. And then yeah, just basically I am just going through. I'll have like some places I've marked where I think music whatever should come in, but I think at that point it's like you're just listening to it, and it's like a feeling kind of like, this is where I think, oh, this kind of music it should come in here, it's gonna like be in fact impactful here. And with like the sort of sound effects and stuff, yeah, I mean, I didn't know how to describe it other than that I just am having fun being like what would sound good and what would sound impactful. So sometimes, and this series has quite a lot of like a sort of scene building type sound effects. So it's like, or sound design, like, the feeling of someone going into a club, or the feeling of this, and like I guess I was trying to make it quite like immersive, and I just really wanted you to feel like you were in all those places, or like, yeah, feeling all of those interactions or things that happened. And I really like it. I think, like, I don't know, when I listened back, I was like, I liked it. I thought it was like, it was nice to have a lot of like, I don't know, like I felt like I still like backed what I did when I listened back to it, if you know what I mean. Like, it was nice for it to feel like hopefully quite immersive. But yeah, I don't know, like I'm just being like maybe this here, and then trying stuff kind of, and like playing around with like how I can manipulate the sound, so it's like you're going into a room or whatever. Like yeah, I don't know if that is like helpful or not, but it's kind of, that's playful, that bit, I think. If yeah, like you just to like, let me try this, and sometimes it doesn't work, and you just throw it in the bin, and you're like, oh, I guess I just spent half an hour for no reason or whatever. But a lot of the time you're like, okay, that was fun and good.
Hey, you got to learn from your failures.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for that question. That was brilliant. I actually wanted to ask about the sound design because, Arlie, when I first we worked together at a production company, not directly, but from my knowledge, you were solely radio producer then, or audio producer. So when did the sound design element come in to your world, and how much experience have you had with it now, and how important do you think it is for producers that might be on a school that to maybe learn a bit of that, or whether they're on day or not, they could just sort of hand that over to somebody else?
Yeah, for sure. So I've just learned it as I went along, because I've pretty much just, well, I have always just done my own sound design for stuff that I've made. So even from when I was just first like teaching myself how to like edit audio and like make little pieces and stuff, I guess I just wanted to do that. So I definitely I think if you're interested in it, the only way to get good at it is just to do it, just to practice. And I always say to people, like, you can just be like, this weekend I'm going to make a 5-minute piece about whatever, something. I'm going to like write a script and record myself and then sound design that, or I'm going to interview someone about something, and then I'm going to like make a little piece. And like doing like small things quickly is a really good way to just like force yourself to practice, and like also not be like, oh, I've got this epic ambitious project I want to do, but just instead be like, what's just something small and quick I can do that will let me start something, finish it, and be able to be like, cool, I did that, move on to the next thing. But yeah, so it's just come like gradually just from practicing and just always like kind of doing my own sound design, and then like obviously like looking at resources and like being like, what stuff, like what podcasts can I listen to like that give advice about this, or like videos and articles, the same, and what anyone would do really, just being like, how do you do this, let me read about it. But also like I remember I used to just list, like when I was trying to first learn this stuff, I would just really listen to every podcast I listened to, being like, what are they doing? Like, why is this good? Like just closely listening to stuff to figure it out, and then you can kind of go and try stuff yourself. Yeah, and then I guess I just like got to the point where I felt confident enough in my abilities that I was like, okay, I feel like I can just say I'm a sound designer now and be like, maybe hire me to do sound design, and then like that kind of worked. So at some point, in terms of like, if you're interested in like doing sound design as a job, sound designing other people's projects and stuff, yeah, you just have to learn it, and you have to be like, at some point when you sort of think you're ready, you just have to kind of back yourself and be like, yeah, like I can do this, and like, yeah, find that like confidence to do that. And but also, just to say to the question, there's also people who are not so into sound design, and like you can totally be a producer that doesn't really do sound design. Like that is a thing. Like, there are, like, I now working as a sound designer, there's lots of projects that where I am brought on, like a producer does that sort of like first stage of like editing, structuring, scripting and all of that, and then I get sent projects and I sound design them. So that, is totally a way of working. I think like if you enjoy doing all the different stuff, you can do as much of what is audio production as you want. But if you actually kind of don't like that, you don't have to. Like it's possible to work and be much more editorial and less on like the sound side. Yeah.
Right. I think it goes, it can also depend on the resources you have, right? So if you're a self employed producer and you're making something on your own, and that's amazing to like try and learn that as much as you can, and back yourself is a great thing as well, because I don't do a lot of sound design in my work, but I would like to learn. And I think, yeah, you quite often think that it's, there are people that are trained at high levels in it, but there is also, you can also get there yourself, and that's a good thing to learn, because you feel like you should know this and this before you begin. This goes back to something Aisha sent earlier, actually. I think we've touched on it a bit, because you were saying about how you got a lot of your sound effects and music from the Epidemic. But did you compose anything yourself, or have you worked with composers before, I suppose?
Yeah.
She says that she thought the synths were really intense and contributed to Section 28's fear-mongering really well. And also like the musical shift around 96, and reflecting the medical breakthrough. Yeah, so it really did lend a lot to this piece. Yeah, did you have to do anything kind of composition wise?
So no, I didn't make any of the music in that. No, I just like played around with it sometimes to like make it sound different or whatever. But yeah, it was all production library music, and I don't really do composing of music. I have like done a little bit of music for some of my own stuff over the years, but like I just at this point don't have like the confidence to be like, I can do this, like pay me to do composition. Like I kind of hope I will get there at some point and I can kind of add that to my like as a string to my bow. But yeah, it's something I've just played around with for myself. So yeah, I've done a little bit of that, but like in a quite DIY way where I'm like, am I doing this in a sensible way? I don't know. But I suppose that speaks to like learning sound design and stuff, is literally just playing and being like, I don't know, let me try this, and if it sounds good, then it's good, you know, like you don't have to question it more than that. But and I have I worked with composers? Yeah, I've done some sound design where there's been a composer who's like been making music for the show, and like maybe like sort of scoring it essentially. And then usually what they'll normally do is kind of they'll take the edit they've got, do scoring to it, then that would get sent to me. I'd get like the track, but usually I get stems as well, so that's like, for anyone that doesn't know, it's like getting sent separately. Here's the strings, here's the percussion, here's the like bass or whatever, and you have like a separate track for all the instruments. So then you can also play around a little bit with like, you know, taking stuff out or like making stuff more prominent and things like that. And then like because I've worked with composers who have literally just like made, say, a library of beds or whatever to use. Like on this show, on the stuff at Vice that I worked on with Muid, like we had a company that like made us essentially a library of stuff, and we had all the stems for it as well, and they were just what they were. And then I've also worked, and they gave us like loopable versions of stuff and things like that. And then I've also worked with like a composer who was like scoring it more, so like listening to the piece and scoring it. And then that process is like, then he would send me that stuff, I would work on the sound design, but then probably there's still some like editorial changes being made, like they're listening to mixes and being like, oh, actually, like, can we take this bit out or make this bit longer or something? So then there'd be a sort of, it goes back to him and he makes some tweaks again to the score and it comes back to me. So it's kind of like a back and forth a little bit. But yeah, and I mean, if you are like into making music and composition and stuff, then that's something you can do. Like you can make your own stuff. And, you know, if you're trying to work as a sound designer, you can also be like, I can compose original music. And I won't be like the best person to give detail on this because I don't currently like do that. But just to say, like, if you are also composing music, then you should be being paid accordingly as well. And you should be like signed up to like the PRS, and you should be getting like paid in that way for that work and stuff. You know, like if a radio doc goes on the radio and is broadcast and it has music in it that you composed, you should not just be getting paid by your client for composing it, but also you should be like signed up to the PRS so they can collect like royalties on your behalf. Yeah, just to say that.
No, it's great because I think we've got a mixed abilities, people here,
yeah,
people cross multi-talented and cross-pollinating in lots of different ways. And we all know, well, some of you might be quite new to this, but music and podcasting can be a bit of a minefield. So it's good to explore all of these options. We have just under 10 minutes left, though. I think I've got through all of the questions, but if I've missed anyone, please just shout out or raise a hand or DM me. In the meantime, I wanted to, back to sort of editorial side, I wanted to ask about working with your host, Sam Smith, how that came about. Was that someone that you found? Was that someone that was given to you by the production company or BBC? And tell us a bit about the kind of time and input that the involvement they had.
Yeah, for sure. So Sam Smith was already attached when I came on, or they were like finalizing the contracts with them. So I wasn't involved in like choosing Sam or whatever. And like I was like a bit nervous about just generally having like a big celebrity presenter, because I was like, my like instinct is like, well, I just don't want someone picked just because they're famous or whatever. That said, like Sam was actually really great to work with, and I think did like such a good job. So it's nothing like against Sam. It's just like my like instinct as a producer is like, well, I don't know, like, is there a person involved in the story that could like present it? But you know, often commissioners are very interested in like obviously famous names, and for sure, like I'm certain a lot more people listen to the show because Sam was attached. So you know, there's like ups, you know, pros and cons to all of that. But yeah, Sam was like already attached, and like what we had was in the contract was like 2 days of time with Sam. So there wasn't, and at that time they were like finishing their album and like getting ready to go on tour and stuff. So it was like classic, okay, finding when can I schedule in with Sam. It was like quite challenging in that way. And we ended up doing it across, in the end, like 4 different studio sessions, but basically their involvement was really to come in and like record the scripts. So we didn't have enough time with them to get them more involved. There was ideas I had of like things I hoped maybe we could do in terms of them maybe coming and being part of some interviews and stuff, but there just wasn't the time to allow for that in their schedule. So yeah, so we had just the studio sessions to record the scripts, and again, because of their like incredibly busy schedule, they weren't even like hearing drafts before. Like they were just coming to the studio and being like, right, let's see what this episode is. So I think they did like an incredibly good job considering of that, and I was like really relieved when we did the first recording, and I was like, okay, they're going to be good. Actually, this isn't, because I was a bit, obviously it's scary just showing up, like fingers crossed this is good. But yeah, they were really great, and they were really, really lovely to work with. And like what the one thing that we did to try to kind of like make it, yeah, like because we couldn't get Sam at any interviews or stuff like that, as much as possible, I didn't want it to just feel like this completely separate person was just like attached as the narrator. Like, and the one thing we were able to do was, which you heard a bit of in that episode, was we would, for each episode, there would be some element of the story where I would ask Sam, can you just like reflect on this a little bit yourself, just like unscripted, like so you know, like at the end of that bit of the episode, we just heard a little bit where I was like, well, this episode is touching around like stigma and shame around like sex, and like the idea of like HIV being passed on through sex and stuff. Do you have any like reflections about your experiences, like and you heard them like actually share like a really personal story, and they were like, basically after a couple of episodes were recorded, they really started, I think, understanding what I kind of was asking of them in that way, and they were really good at it. Like they were really up for it and good at kind of just riffing and being like, yeah, okay, I'll talk about this. And that really helped to have those little bits throughout the series where we could weave in like Sam talking in an unscripted way about a little bit more of a personal take, because it just added a little bit more of them into it, so it didn't just feel like, well, anyone could have been reading this script. So that's like a little, if someone's up for it, a little tip for like a way of trying to add a bit more of a personal touch when you do have that really limited time with a presenter, which does happen often. It's very often the case that presenters don't have that much involvement in the making of a thing.
Yeah, I thought it was good to mention that, because that was a big thing that I discovered when I started making documentaries early on, is I always presumed that whoever was reading that script was quite heavily involved, and often in obviously more modern podcasts that can be, if it's a grassroots thing or whatever. But yeah, there are a lot, certainly with the BBC as well. I think in my experience, quite often they're already like dictated to you, or they have an idea in their mind. It might even be that they want a BBC presenter to host it, and that's probably budgets, or it depends on the network, it depends on the thing. But it's good to be aware of as a producer coming in, that you might have this grand idea for what you want them to put into it, and what you think you're going to be working side by side with them, but actually you might, the best way of doing it is what you've just said, Arlie, and giving them a chance to insert themselves in where they can in a natural way. So it's not, because I have heard some, unfortunately, where even I've made my own, where you've had to just give a script to someone and they've read it verbatim, and it's a shame. But
yeah,
you know, the audience doesn't always know, but as a producer we always want to make the best of these situations, don't we? Okay, Roa, can I come to you, please? And I'm sorry for shouting you out in the forgetting that I was sharing my sound. I just wanted to make sure I got your pronunciation right of your name. If you'd like to
No, you
ask your
got it right.
question. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. So there's like two questions. One's a quick one, one's a slightly longer one. But so like the way that you were able to kind of weave together all the different stories from different people. So whether it's different people who, you know, did have HIV, but then you also had like the story of how the medication was developed. Freddie Mercury is in there, and it was all like weaved together in a way that kind of felt really reflective of real life and the way that everyone's stories do weave together. Is there a way that you go about doing that to try and make it sort of reflective of real life, or is it sort of just working on it and it sort of fleshes out that way? And the second question was for someone who's starting out and doesn't necessarily have like a lot of money to put into like programs and stuff, is there a program that's like cheap that you would recommend to someone starting out? Thank you.
Cool. Right, I'll just do the questions in order. So thank you for saying that it like weaves together nice. That was like nice to hear. So I guess like, well, one of the reasons it's like that, I think, was a note that my exec producer gave me early that was like a really important thing to be reminded of. Was he was like, especially because Sam Smith is going to have lots of like younger fans who might listen to this. And I actually know that like if no one else listened to this, the Sam Smith stans all listen to it. And so I at least know that a bunch of young people that love Sam Smith heard this podcast, and that's actually quite nice. But he was like, you've got to remember that there'll be some people that are young enough listening to this that they won't know any of this. Like some of this historical stuff, they're not going to have like no idea. They won't have any idea what it was like to live then. They won't know that any of these events happened. So anything that I might have taken for granted, like Section 28 or the AIDS crisis itself in the 80s, like all of these like sort of historical moments, actually to kind of assume the listener maybe doesn't know about that. And then the challenge is like, okay, explain all that historical context in a way that like somebody who does know it isn't going to feel like I know, and someone who doesn't know it can get the information and understand it. So that, and I think you hear a lot of that in that episode of that like contextualizing. I'm trying to think, yeah, like how to explain. I mean, so it's basically like the way we did it, I suppose, like the tools at your disposal are you've got your script, so stuff that your narrator can say, you've got your contributors, so how can you ask them questions that both speak to their story but also like help us contextualize the history. You know, it might be just being like, oh, describe to me like what was it like at that time, or like literally saying there'll be people listening who actually don't know what was it like at this time or in that place, can you just explain it and stuff. And then you've got archive is the other like, you know, big thing that you've got at your disposal, and so we've like used that quite a bit there, like and making like little montages. And I think like I guess the way to think about the weaving together is to think of all those different things that you have, the narrator, the contributors, archive, and then the way you are using music to tie that all together. And when you're like writing script around all those elements and stuff, think of it as one thing. Don't think of it as like script and then separately this, but really be like I don't know, you could almost see it as like making a sculpture or something, or you know, like you're trying to those elements ultimately are one, and it's like, how can I elegantly connect all of these things? Like, what's the right thing to say with the script, and what's the right thing to just let it come through in this archive? And it kind of then goes back to that sound design stuff of just playing and moving things around and just being like, what feels good. And like what's really nice is when you're making something and you get that feeling of like, yes, this is like banging, like you can just hear it and you're like, it's just like really works. So I guess you're trying to go for that. But yeah, is that sort of helpful?
Yeah, no, massively, because like sort of the question of whether like you say, you think of it almost like writing it as if you were hearing it in your head, or whether or not it is just the whole process of here's all these sections and how do we, you know, I suppose it's like you say, it's sort of somewhat both, but it is mostly.
Yeah. And
like,
if you're thinking ahead about that, if you're like, I know I have to create this, this is some of what I need to achieve with this thing, is to sort of like explain this history and blah, blah, blah. If you've thought about that before you're even recording interviews, then you know to include in the interview prep, let me ask about this and this. And then you might end up with a situation where you're like, well, I've got a choice. I can have the contributor say this because I've got them saying it, or I could write it for Sam to say in the script, or I could use archive. And then you can really just decide like what is going to sound good and really land, like how will I choose who to have, you know, say all these different things. So yeah. And then to answer your second question about software, yeah, like, so the software I would recommend is Reaper, which is what I use. So Reaper is an extremely good bit of software. Like, if anyone says it's not as good as Pro Tools, it is as good as Pro Tools. There's many a person that says it's better than Pro Tools. And Reaper is very affordable, so it has a never-ending free trial. So if you just don't have any like money to spend on this, you can simply use Reaper for free forever and nothing bad will ever happen to you. It will just pop up every time you open it and it will say, by the way, you haven't bought this, and you'll just be like, I know, and you carry on using it. And if you don't have any money, that's fine, do it. That's why they've made it free. And if you do have a little bit of money, you can buy a personal individual license, which costs about $60. And that's like a one-off fee. And then if you are like doing this as your job, and I think their recommended thing is like if you earn like $20,000 or more from this work a year, then you should buy a commercial license, which is also only a couple of £100. So, you know, if you are doing this as your job and you're earning that amount of money, probably you should find a moment to spend the money on the commercial license. But yeah, Reaper, it's like you'll be using like the most banging software, and you can have it for nothing, or you can have it for $60, whatever you prefer. I think I heard this from Hammy, one of our fellows. Hammy to Jesse to me, that somebody once described it as the only door with a soul, and I really have taken that on and said that to so many people. So thanks.
I like that. Yeah, we need more of that in the world, obviously.
Exactly.
Oh, thank you so much for answering all of that. I appreciate
No worries. Yeah, no worries.
I love that. I will bear that in mind next time my Reaper crashes on me.
When's that happen?
People
Never
keep telling me
happened.
to get Ableton, and I'm like, how much money do you think I've got? No. Well, that's very reassuring. We have run over slightly. I just want to see if anyone else wanted to do any last questions. Thanks for sticking with us. I also wanted to shout out Helen and Murray, who did throw questions in, but I'm pretty sure we covered them within the conversation. I know Murray's jumped off now, but thank you anyway. And thanks to Martha as well, who sent a lovely message. Yeah, I suppose the last things to say is, Arlie, where can people follow you and find your next work?
Sure. Oh yeah, so I have like a website where I put my work. It's just arlie.me. So I usually just post my stuff on there. I guess I do technically still have a Twitter account, but I have to say that I have not opened that in a very long time. I don't really intend to. And probably should just like delete the profile. I have Instagram, it's just my name, Arlie Adlington. I will say that's a lot of me just going on bike rides and like meeting dogs, but if you want to stay in touch, you're welcome to follow me there. And I post a little bit of audio stuff there sometimes. Yeah, and if anyone wants to follow up with anything, I'll put my email address in the chat. I'm happy to like stay in touch that way.
Wicked. Thank you so much, Arlie.